All right, so welcome to the fourth in our series on Middle Eastern Islamic history. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the Rashidun, or rightly guided caliphate. Rashidun just means rightly guided people in Arabic. So for those of you who are uninitiated, there are some rules. The first one is that this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the doctrines we're going to be discussing today. Thankfully, this is going to be just a presentation by somebody who's very interested in the topic, and hopefully with a fellow group of listeners who are also interested. And this presentation is going to be from a secular perspective. So there will be times when I'll sort of pull back and discuss things from a neutral perspective. Of course, this is religious history as well, right? Muslims learn about this history as the foundation of their faith. But at the same time, I'm not going to be operating from that place. I'm going to be operating from a historical lens. Will Wheaton's law, don't be a dick. If you have to have that explained to you, we're probably on the wrong side of this. So yeah, just be respectful and treat this topic with the respect it deserves. And to that, there's all kinds of questions, comments, clarifications. Please ask whatever is interesting, or comment or add, share. I'm more than willing to learn with you. Now, as my other lessons have been, this will be a 101 and a 201, by which I mean that we will cover the basics if you don't know anything. And if you know something, we're going to take it also up to the 201 level with additional information and insight. And of course, this is being recorded. So if you miss this, or you want to catch up on lessons, or you want to see something that I said before, because I referenced something that I mentioned in a previous lecture, and you want to see it in a little bit more depth, well, it's recorded. So you have that pride and joy. So, as everybody is excited about, it's the quiz. See what you guys remembered from last time when we discussed the world in which Muhammad grew up. So, first question: what was the source of wealth for most Arabian states?
Is that B?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Jason got it. It's B. They had high volumes of trade, especially in fragrance and spices. One of the things that people tend to think is that the Arabian states were all impoverished. And this was certainly the case in the beginning of the 20th century, that without oil, because the oil wealth would come in the 1920s, without oil, the Arabian states were relatively poor. But at this period in time, especially if we look at Yemen as an example, we have wealthy states. And another thing is that while they had advanced masonry, right, we saw that Dam and Ma'arib, they didn't export this technology, which is why A is wrong. C is wrong in that they were hired as vassal states to the larger empires, but their men were not sent as mercenaries. And so that is question one. Question number two: which of the following accurately describes the religious situation in Arabia in the early 600s?
I'm comfortable with B on that one.
E.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mark, was that you?
I was on mute while somebody else was saying the same thing.
That was me.
Yeah.
Oh, it's Howard. Okay. Wow, we're getting competitive here. All right. Yes, exactly. There was a great diversity of religions, including Arab polytheism, right? We talked about that with Allah, al-Uzza, and some of the other goddesses. We also saw that there's Greek religion there, there's Judaism, there's Christianity, there's all kinds of religions in this sort of melting pot. All right, question number three. Which of the battles did the Muslims win? Choose all that apply. These were the battles that were fought during Muhammad's life. These are the big ones. He fought a number of smaller battles or raids, but these are the five largest battles he fought. He won some and he lost some. Which ones did he win?
He lost C, right? The trench. He lost.
No.
He won? Okay, sorry.
I wasn't there for the last one, but I would guess that he won the last three because that's when things started to go in his favor.
So I think its answer is A,
Mm-hmm.
and then C, and then D. I'm not sure about the Muta. It might be E also. So,
It's
except for the Huda.
Uhud was a loss and Muta was a loss. So it was A, C, and D. Yeah, so the Battle of Badr was a victory. It was an early victory. It was the first time that Muhammad had gone into battle, and he was able to be successful. Uhud was where Khalid ibn Walid was the general on the side of the Meccans, right, fighting against the Muslims, and he was able to rout them after their archers abandoned the defensive position. The Battle of the Trench was where Muhammad built a trench around the city of Medina and was able to effectively outlast the siege that the Meccans tried to put against Medina. The Battle of Mecca was fought when Muhammad divided his forces into 4 columns and marched against the city of Mecca. Only one of the 4 columns met any resistance, and that resistance was easily overcome. And the Battle of Muta was a group of Muslims that were sent as a number of Muslims were sent as emissaries to the various kingdoms surrounding Arabia in order to request their allegiance and their submission to Islam. And in the location of Muta, one of these ambassadors was attacked, and so Muhammad responded, but he didn't respond with adequate forces, and so the Byzantines were able to meet him there and defeat him. All right, question number 4. Which statement accurately reflects the relationship between Aksum, modern Ethiopia, and Arabia?
Is D?
It's not D.
Oh, come on.
Seems like a B.
It's B, right?
Sorry?
B.
It's B.
B as in boy.
Oh, okay, because I was going to say there's no E. No, it's not B either.
That must be C.
Yeah, it's C. But I'm not counting this one because you can't get 2 bites at the apple. But we discussed how Aksum actually invaded the kingdom of Himyar that was ruled by the Jewish Dhu Nawas, right? The Yemeni kingdom of Himyar was ruled by the Jews, and they were repressing Christians who were living in their territory, especially in the city of Najran. And so the Ethiopians of Aksum invaded and deposed the Nawas and appointed their own general named Abreha as the king of Himyar. So you had this Aksumite Himyar, and they marched elephants all the way to Mecca. And of course, that was the whole year of the elephant incident. The Persians ended up working with the Yemeni to expel the Aksumite government in Yemen by 578. So we should see that there's actually a very strong relationship and interaction between Ethiopia and Arabia. All right, question number 5. Which 3 of the following are arguments of an Islamologist and not an Islamic scholar? Yeah, so which 3 of these would you expect an Islamologist to say?
What's the difference between an Islamologist and an Islamic scholar?
Well, I mean, that was sort of the one.
Are you
of the
assuming
major
the Islamic scholar is religious?
Yes, exactly. An Islamic scholar is somebody who comes from the Islamic religious tradition, and an Islamologist is somebody who approaches Islam from a secular scholarly perspective.
Okay. So that could include the idiot that runs Jihad Watch.
It could. I don't know how scholarly he is in terms of his approach.
I think it's a she.
I think it's E.
Well, there are 3 of them.
Oh, there are 3. Oh, which 3?
Well, then E for sure, and then
Okay.
I would say F.
Okay. And what's your 3rd one, Zach?
I don't know. I'll take a D. I don't know.
Yeah, D.
You were very close. E and F are both right answers. The 3rd right answer is A. Muslims do not believe, and Islamologists would argue, some of them have, like Patricia Crona, that the Arab invasion of Palestine was some Jewish messianic movement. And then the stories that we talked about where there was hardship in the relationship between the Muslims and the Jews, were a way that Muslims could retroactively define themselves as a separate group of people. Muslims would argue that the story that we told, where there was Muhammad, he had the revelation from Gabriel. Islam was a successor faith to Judaism, holding in kind the teachings that were taught in Judaism as it was originally created, and that the Jews of Muhammad's time were following Judaism incorrectly, but that the religion of Muhammad was at all times not a Jewish Messianic movement, but a distinct religion itself, Islam, right? The argument that Muhammad was a preacher in Mecca is an Islamic scholar argument. The Ridda Wars is well attested to by Islamic scholars in terms of how they think that it affected Muslim jurisprudence. And the Islamic Empire leadership was not held in common under either the Islamologist perspective or the Muslim Islamic scholars perspective. All right, so that was our quiz. And so we get back to our region, right? Our region with 6 distinct areas. And we've discussed how moving into the medieval period, which is where we are now, we have really 2 dominant powers. And these will be the dominant powers all the way up until today, right? You have Anatolia in the west, and you have Persia in the east. Those are your 2 dominant powers. The other 4 regions of the Middle East are never going to be dominant once we get out of the ancient period, with one exception, of course, and that's today's lecture, right? In today's lecture, we're going to see a force come out of Arabia and sublimate the entire Middle East to its will, right? So that's one of the strangest events in Middle Eastern history. It doesn't have any parallel because in the ancient period, right, the 2 dominant regions were Egypt and Mesopotamia. Then when the Persians conquered both Mesopotamia and Egypt, Persia became the dominant power, with Anatolia being a close second under the Roman period. And then those 2 powers would begin to sort of fight at each other's heels for a while. All right. So, and we discussed how as the Islamic empire was being put together, as Muhammad was finally getting his confederation together, this was the exact same time that the Byzantines and Sassanians were completely destroying each other, right? This was the 3rd Byzantine Sassanian War. And if we remember, right, that war put the Byzantines and their allies against the Sassanids and their allies. And if you look at this map, you can see that there are a number of areas in the Byzantine Empire that have sort of a cross-hatching. If you look very close, those are areas that the Persians took control of during the war. So you can see significant portions of the Byzantine Empire were under Sassanian control before the Byzantines were able to force a stalemate. Another thing to notice is that both of these empires are protected by a narrow band of Arabian states that are in vassalhood to them, right? You have the Banu Ghassan or the Ghassanids, who are the vassals of the Byzantines, and the Banu Lahm or the Lakhmids, who are the vassals of the Persians. The problem, of course, is that starting in the early days of the war in around 602, right, if we remember, the Sassanids actually overthrew the Lakhmids and incorporated their region directly into Persia. At the same time, we remember that the war started because this man Phocas removed Maurice, and Shah Khosrow of the Sassanids declared war on the Byzantine Empire to as sort of punishment for the removal of and execution of Maurice. So, and you can see at this point in 622, right, if we remember from our Islamic history, 622 is the year of the Hijrah, right? So that's exactly what's going on on their side. And but this is the biggest point where Khosrow II is nearly victorious. The Persian Empire, you can see, has conquered most of the areas of the Byzantine heartland, taking Anatolia, the Levant region, Egypt, and that's when Emperor Heraclius has to make a daring move to attack into the Persian heartland in order to effect change against Khosrow II. And he does so, which is why you have the peace treaty that there was. As we mentioned, 628 was when that war ended. So just at the end of that, we see the Muslim interaction, right? So 628, the Third Byzantine Sassanian War ends. The Sassanian Empire is falling into disarray. They have 14 shahs in a period of 7 years. So you can imagine how confused and afraid they are. And the Byzantine side, Heraclius is just putting together the defenses. His treasury is completely spent in trying to prosecute this war. There are really no winners from that conflict. But it's at this moment that the Arabs send their emissary, and you can see this is a recreation of the letter that on the upper right-hand side that Muhammad sent to Heraclius, emperor of the Romans. And a carrier of this letter or a letter similar to it was attacked, which is why the Arabs sent forces as a response to killing of an ambassador. The Ghassanid defenses, you can imagine, the Ghassanid and Byzantine defenses, you can see sort of a picture in the lower side what those would have looked like, held firm and defeated the Muslims at Muta. Yeah, go ahead.
Question, Richard. So, as we know, obviously, this was, war of attrition between Sassanids and Byzantium. Was there any attempt to unite, having seen such force?
At the Battle of Muta, it was a very small Arab force, but later on, yes, there are outreaches from the Persian Empire to Rome to create some sort of united front against the Arabs. But because of the mistrust that had developed over those 20 plus years of war, none of the commanders took each other seriously. You also had during that war a number of commanders defecting for whatever reason to the other side. So there was also a lot of fear that that they couldn't trust the commanders to be loyal to the flag that they originally came from if they did go into some sort of alliance like this. And in the lower right-hand side, you can see one of the few archaeological remains from Muta, because Muta is not a inhabited city anymore.
Richard, a quick question. Was the killing of the ambassador a decision by the emperor, or was that just done locally?
I believe it was done locally, but I don't know for sure. If anybody else knows. Yeah. So as we mentioned in 630, so the conquest of Mecca is finalized, and Muhammad goes into the Kaaba and destroys the idols. You can see on the left-hand side, the fire in the upper left-hand side is actually the representation of Muhammad in this painting, right? That way they didn't paint Muhammad himself. But you can see along the left side and the top side, you have visions of the idols that were smashed and destroyed inside the Kaaba. And Muhammad has a proclamation that he has Ali deliver. And this Ali is his cousin, as well as being his son-in-law, because in his case, his cousin married his daughter. So Ali gives a proclamation, and the proclamation has three major points. The first one is that the Kaaba now became an exclusively Muslim area, right? One of the things that we remember from the last lecture is that the Kaaba was an area where all Arabians of all different faiths had their idols and could see it as a sacred site. And right, this was how Mecca was able to be a peaceful area with a high level of commerce and trade. Now only Muslims were allowed to visit the Kaaba. The second one is sort of a no-brainer, but this is a holy site, and so nobody should be allowed to be naked in front of it. And the third one is that polytheism could not be tolerated anymore, right? So you had a number of polytheistic groups. Remember, we had all these different religions. Some of them had agreements with Muhammad. Those agreements would be honored for as long as the duration of that agreement was. Usually these agreements would expire in several years. Those who did not have an agreement had 4 months to either convert or leave. Arabia was to be a place only for monotheistic religions, like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, under this proclamation of Ali. All right. So now we move into the period after Muhammad dies. Muhammad dies in the year 632. And so there's a big question as to who is going to succeed him. Jason, you have a question?
Yes, you talk about the proclamation of Ali, and you said only Muslim can be in Kaaba.
Yes.
But I remember last time, 2 weeks ago, you talk about the when they doing the annual pilgrim, and some non-Muslims allowed to go, right?
No, the annual pilgrimage is only for Muslims.
Only Muslim.
Yes.
But remember that as people wear different clothes because they are not Muslim?
No, the different clothes were white if you're male, black if you're female, green if you're the cleaning staff.
Okay, so for example, like I cannot go. I have no chance to go there.
Correct. Under the current government of Saudi Arabia, which many Muslims will point out is more extreme than other Muslim governments, but under the government of Saudi Arabia, the entire city of Mecca is off limits to non-Muslims. Like there are literally signs on the highway that say non-Muslims drive here.
But there were some examples of some non-Muslims pretending to be Muslims. I know there was one of the British journalists did it, but in 19th century, I think.
Yeah, no, there are examples of non-Muslims going, but they're not going with permission. Yeah, exactly. They're sneaking in.
By the way, do you hear me well?
Yeah, we can, Greg. I have a question from the chat. Can you visit mosques in Saudi Arabia? I assume you, as a non-Muslim. The Masjid al-Nabawi, the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, as well as the entire city of Mecca, are off limits to non-Muslims. Whether a non-Muslim can go to any mosque, I would highly doubt, but I imagine that there are probably a few specific mosques designed for tourists that you'd be permitted to go in, but I don't know any names offhand. I know, for example, in the Emirates, there's the Zayd ibn Nahyan Mosque in Abu Dhabi that is accessible to non-Muslims, even though the majority of mosques in Abu Dhabi are not accessible to non-Muslims.
Just to clarify, Richard, this is Nurul. So there is no religious restriction in non-Muslim going into a mosque. It depends on the country that you're living in and the jurisdiction that they follow. So, if you're in the United States, you can come down and visit any mosque anytime. So there is no restriction. In religious context, there is no restriction as such, just to clarify that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nurul. Okay.
And just how will that be interpreted? Like I would assume that walking a mosque and taking pictures would be considered really bad manners.
Well, it depends on the mosque, right? It's the same with a church, right? If you go to somebody's local mosque, right, one of these local masjids for, like 100 people, and you start taking pictures everywhere while people are praying, well, then people are going to get angry at you. But it's the same if you went to somebody's local church and started taking pictures everywhere while people were praying. Like it's just disrespectful. But if you're going to one of these jama, one of these large, national monument type of mosques, then yeah, it's sort of an expectation. And there's usually, and similar to large cathedrals or similarly sized churches that are not cathedrals because they don't have cathedra, right? There's an expectation that tourists go there. And so there's a whole tourist market associated with that. The same is true of mosques. There are mosques that are large and designed to be impressive buildings that have a touristic value, and then you can visit. I also have a point in the comments. Non-Muslims are forbidden from going to mosques in Morocco, with the exception of the Hassan II Mosque in Casablanca. But this is because of laws that existed during the French colonial period that have sort of just never died down. All right, so we get to the moment that Muhammad passes, and Abu Bakr, his father-in-law, because he's the father of Muhammad's youngest wife, Aisha, Abu Bakr issues a proclamation saying, if anybody worships Muhammad, Muhammad is dead. But if anybody worships God, God is alive and immortal, right? Which defined that Muhammad was not God, that God is this was obviously part of Islam from before, but it clarified this understanding. And the Arab tribes that had become part of the Muslim coalition began to debate the future of what would go on, and they had what was called Shura, or a council where they were discussing that. You can sort of see that visualized on the left-hand side. And Abu Bakr and Omar joined this council and nominated Abu Bakr as the first caliph. Now, the word caliph itself comes from khalifa in Arabic, meaning successor, right? So the title is literally that he is the successor to Muhammad, but only in the political sense, right? Because Muhammad was sort of two things at the same time. He was a prophet, where he was receiving messages from God, but at the same time, he was a political leader. He had under the constitution of Medina, he was the chief arbitrator of Medina. And once he unified Arabia, he was in charge of what was effectively a small empire. So you needed somebody to run the operation of this empire. And so that was what the Khalifa did. In terms of the prophecy was deemed to be ended when Muhammad died. Part of this was because there were a number of other Arabians who were now declaring themselves to be prophets and attacking the Muslim community for it.
Richard,
yeah.
Could you explain the relations of Umar and Uman to Prophet? To
Sure.
Muhammad?
Sure. Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, a lot of these people that we're going to be meeting today are Sahaba, or apostles of Muhammad. Muhammad had a number of individuals who were his close followers and with whom he made political decisions. And so these individuals are called Sahaba, or apostles in English typically. They're the ones who are generally at the center of the major political issues that happen in the earliest period of Islam as a political group. Now, Abu Bakr is elected by the Shura, but there is a of Muslims that disagree with his nomination. They're called the party of Ali, right? Party in the political sense in Arabic is Shia. So Shia to Ali became the party of Ali, which of course became shortened from Shia to Ali to Shia. So this is the genesis of Shiism, but of course it doesn't have any distinct religious value at this point. It would acquire that as time goes on, but at this moment it's strictly a political decision. And they refer to the events of Ghadir, on which you can see a Shiite painting of the events of Ghadir on the right hand side, and you can see Muhammad is blanked out. He has there's the turban and then the white shroud, right? So that way Muhammad is not depicted. But with Muhammad is Ali. You can also see that Muhammad has sort of a fire halo, right? But Ali has it too, which shows the kind of heightened state of veneration that Ali receives in Shiism as time goes on. Now, according to the Sunnis and the Shiites, Ali was one of the purest and most faithful of the Sahaba. And the difference comes in that at this event, the Shiites argue that Muhammad was praising Ali with a hidden meaning, a batini meaning, right? We learned about zahiri and batini, right? Apparential and hidden. So with a hidden meaning that Ali should be his true successor. The Sunnis say that there was no such hidden meaning, that the apparential meaning that Muhammad was commending Ali was the one that should be taken. And so there's no reason based on this that Ali should be a successor. Abu Bakr, being that he's older and more experienced, would be the right person to lead the empire. So there's also something else that we should point out at this point, which is that there was a hadith that was accepted by both Sunnis and Shia that the leader of whatever Islamic configuration there was had to be from the Quraysh tribe. The Quraysh tribe was Muhammad's tribe, and specifically Muhammad came from the Banu Hisham, the Hashim clan. Now, clans are these groups of families that sit within the larger tribe, right? So there are multiple clans within one tribe. And so the Banu Hashim are probably the most famous clan because they were Muhammad's clan. You can see in the upper right-hand side sort of a number of pictures of the recent 5 kings of Jordan. The Jordan kings are all, they claim to be of the Banu Hashim even today, right? Because it's an important legitimator to their right to rule, the fact that they are Banu Hashim, that they are of the Hashim clan. So Abu Bakr's reign was predominantly taken up by these Ridda wars. So as we mentioned last time, there were a number of different groups throughout Arabia that had pledged loyalty to Muhammad and considered that their loyalty ended when his life did. And so these groups declared independence. Abu Bakr rallied the Muslims together to fight these different groups. Additionally, a number of these groups claimed to have their own prophets, which is why it was important to create the idea of the capstone, right? Muhammad had revealed during his time in the Quran and during this period, Abu Bakr reinforced the idea that Muhammad was the final prophet. And so that all of these prophets that were rising up in Arabia to sort of be the spiritual successors of Muhammad could not be. By and large, Abu Bakr was successful in the Ridda wars and was able to reunite Arabia around his person. Now, as a part of this experience, the idea of apostasy became extremely negatively viewed in Islamic circles, because apostasy wasn't simply a religious crime, it was also a political crime, in that you were acting treasonously to the state. There are Muslims today who have disentangled this relationship, but there are also Muslims today who haven't, which is why apostasy is such a triggering issue in the Islamic world today. Probably the most important battle was the Battle of Yamama in 632. And it was after this battle that a number of Hafid, or Quran memorizers, were killed. So this led Abu Bakr to try and solidify the remaining qira'at, or readings of the Quran, into one version, according to Islamic scholars.
Richard,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can I backtrack a bit?
Sure.
The Jordan royal family, they can trace back to Muhammad. How about
No. They can trace back to Muhammad's clan, to his family, but they're not his descendants.
Wow, what a difference.
Yeah, well, I mean, if
from
they
the
were
village, from the clan village or something.
Yeah, so they're his family, but they're descended from people who are not Muhammad himself.
So when you say clan, it's like maybe that village in a tribe or something, that particular place.
It's not a village per se. I guess the best way to understand it is that you have a group of families that are themselves related to each other, right? So that group of families that is related to each other, because there's one large, like, for example, if you're married to somebody, right, you take on their last name, right? And as a woman, and men typically don't do this. So if you go to a family get together, there's probably, if there's 35 people, there's probably about 7 different last names, right? Because of the different people who are marrying to each other. But that conglomeration is a clan, right? Once you have, let's say 5,000 people, right? As opposed to the 35 in your immediate family, let's say you have 5,000 people, that's a clan now, right? And that clan would be subordinate to a tribe, which might be 20,000, 30,000 people.
And may I ask, how about the royal family in Saudi Arabia or other places? They all kind of descendant from Muhammad's clan or not? So my question is that
No.
Kings and royal family, do they have to be from the Muhammad clan to be eligible to be king or something like that?
So,
thank you.
Yeah, no. So this is actually a very interesting thing. The royal family, the Saud family, doesn't have this right to rule. They're not from the Quraysh. So one of the things that they did in order to secure their rule was they allied with the Wahhabi, who were a very devout religious order. Now we can agree or disagree about where they fall within the specter of the various Islamic sects and groups, but they used the instantiation of this religious group in order to legitimate their rule. There are other cases, like for example, the kings of Morocco, where they claim to also be Quraysh. I don't know which clan they claim to be from. Maybe Banu Tamim. But you have a lot of kings in the Arab world trying to claim that they are from one of the clans that sits within the tribe of Quraysh. Because the tribe of Quraysh is the only one that has the legitimate right to rule.
So after thousands of years, there probably some chance that somehow they're probably related, because you have thousands of years to intermarriage and everything.
Right, of course. It depends how you see the claim, right? It's yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no
Richard,
problem.
one more in relation to the Battle of Yamama, where you said so many Quran readers were killed. Was that deliberate, or was that just they grouped them together, or were they obvious targets? How did that happen?
No, the Battle of Yamama just had a very high casualty rate, and I think it was bad planning on Abu Bakr's part in terms of how he allocated his soldiers, but he didn't have that many to spare, right? And so after there were heavy casualties on that day, a significant percentage of the Quran memorizers, these Hafid, were killed off. And so in order to prevent the next battle from basically wiping the Quran from existence, he tried to consolidate it in a written document.
Risha, I'm not sure if I missed this point, but does both groups, Shia and Sunni, accept the fact that Ali was at least politically inheriting Muhammad's empire?
No. The Shiite believe this to be the case. The Sunnis believe that Muhammad was praising Ali for his purity and for his faith, but those accolades were just that. There was no hidden meaning that Ali was to assume the caliphate. The Shiites believe that the hidden meaning was clear to anybody who truly understood what was going on at that event. Right, and this is one of the things we talked about in our first lecture about Zahiriya and Batiniya, right? That Sunnism tends to be much more concerned with Zahiriya, that which is apparent, that which is directly observable. Shiite Islam is much more concerned oftentimes with Batiniya, that which is supposedly secretly delivered, but the direct claims don't lead necessarily to that conclusion. You have to understand the context. All right. So towards the end of Abu Bakr's reign, and he dies in his sleep, it's just that he's a very old man, there begin to be raids against the southwestern border of the Sassanid Persian Empire. You can see on this map, Sassanid Persia is controlling Iraq, which is why you have the two rivers. And the yellow is the areas controlled by the Sassanids. The green is the area controlled by the Rashidun Caliphate under Abu Bakr. And red, pink is the Byzantine Empire. Now, if we remember correctly, the border between the Persian Empire and the Rashidun Caliphate was occupied by the Lakhmids, and they had their sort of buffer state there. However, in 602, Khosrow II, in his arrogance, decided to annex them, and he destroyed their castle at Hira, which was called the Khornak. You can see sort of in that small circle, the one picture we have of the construction of Khornak. Now, because the castle was destroyed by the Sassanids, and there was so much political intrigue and fighting in the wake of the Third Byzantine Sassanian War, this area had not been built up in terms of its effective defenses. And the Lakhmids, who would ordinarily have patrolled this, were now sublimated to the Sassanid intrigue. So this provided the opportunity for al-Muthanna to begin to perform a number of raids against the Sassanids. Knowing, Abu Bakr knew that the Sassanids would eventually retaliate for all of these raids. There was going to be a period when the Sassanids would be stable, and then they would attack the Muslim Empire. And the Sassanids were certainly strong enough that they could destroy the Sassanids if it was on the Sassanids' terms. So he sends Khalid ibn Walid to, who is, of course, the best general that the Muslims have, to fight in Mesopotamia, and therefore secure that the first blow would be launched by the Muslims and not by the Sassanids. And so you can see, if you follow the path, he attacks 5 different cities on the way to Hira, and he takes Hira, and then he continues up along the the Euphrates River Valley. In the so doing, he created his own shock troops called Mubaris, or the prominent ones. Now, these Mubaris, or prominent ones, were elite cavalry shock troops. You can sort of imagine them like the figure on the right-hand side. And Khalid ibn Walid was a master tactician. He was able to outflank the Persians, who numbered more greatly than he did on a number of occasions, and win every single one of his engagements. You can also see in red circled is Ctesiphon, which is the Persian capital. So you can see how close to the border it is and how susceptible it would be to attack. When Khalid ibn Walid got to Firaz, which is on the border with the Byzantine territory, that was about the time when Abu Bakr died. So the control of the army shifted to the next caliph, who was Omar. Now, Omar was another one. Omar ibn Khattab was another one of these Sahaba, one of these apostles. And Omar is responsible for a number of different changes and characteristics that are worth pointing out. So the first one is that he saw himself as unchanged, regardless of the political changes that the Muslim empire was going through. So one of the more famous things, and we'll talk about this, is that he conquered Jerusalem. And when he conquered Jerusalem, he was riding on horseback, and his servant had a donkey, and they would switch periodically. The servant would occasionally ride on the horse, and Omar would guide the donkey, and then vice versa, because the horse needed to rest from time to time. When they finally got to Jerusalem, it was Omar's turn to be on the donkey, and so Omar entered the city he had just conquered on a donkey, a show of incredible humility. It seems that through the entirety of his caliphate, he never tried to take on the aspects of royalty, instead acting as if he were still a tribal Arabian in that sense of humility and sense of self. He was also responsible for a number of construction projects. You can see the Basra Canal. Obviously, this is a more modern canal that exists in Basra. And even now, this canal is not functioning. This is a picture from the 1920s. Now this canal has been completely dredged, partially as a result of Saddam's rerouting of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and partially as a result of garbage accumulating. But he built numerous canals throughout the empire he controlled, including, as I pointed out, at Basra. He was the one who standardized the Islamic calendar, which starts based on the date of the Hijrah, that escape that Muhammad made from Mecca to Medina. He also instituted 2 major laws that are going to have huge impact later on. The first one you can see represented by the actual proclamation itself on the right-hand side is the Pact of Omar, or the Al-Ahda al-Umariyah. And in this Pact of Omar, there is an instantiation that Jews and Christians are second-class citizens, and what that means, and that Jews and Christians would be forbidden from living on the Arabian Peninsula, that they would be resettled in the Levant or in Mesopotamia. There is conjecture as to whether the Pact of Omar actually dates from Omar, or whether this was a document that was written in the future and then expounded to the past. But this set the stage, regardless of whether it was a real document or a forgery, because it had Omar's imprimatur on it. It became a standard for the treatment of Jews and Christians. And of course, this would vary from empire to empire and time to time, but it provided legitimacy to a number of the discriminatory practices that would occur in the future. The next one is that Omar set the stage for what Islamic slavery would look like. When Omar was ruling, he made it law that no Muslim could take another Muslim as a slave, which meant that in order to have slaves, since a number of individuals in the Muslim community wanted to have slaves, they would need to go and trade for them. And this created one of the first, if not the first, systems of transportational slavery, in that a slave would be acquired in location A, but would live with somebody who had not captured him in location B, right, through the process of commerce, right? Typically, slaves at this time were the result of captives of war or serfdom or something similar to that, and so they would serve the master in the place that they were captured. The idea of buying and selling slaves on a large-scale market that included transportation between jurisdictions would be a direct result of Omar's edict that Muslims could not take other Muslims as slaves, and the decreasing population of non-Muslims as time went on.
So Richard.
Yes.
Means that before that, there's no slave, or they were slave, and he just come out with the rules.
No, there were slaves. The thing is that
Muslim slaves.
Sorry?
Muslim slaves.
There had been Muslim slaves prior to that point. Those were manumitted. Those were made free.
Oh. You know why did he do that?
He believed that no person could be an honorable Muslim if he was enslaved. He couldn't freely worship God if he was a slave. And so that was his justification.
Sorry, Richard, I know that during the time there's a lot of slave was captured from Africa, and then later on they converted to Islam, right? But does their master make them to convert, or what's the process make them to convert?
Sure. The Islamic slave trade in Africa really picks up in about 300 years. So it's a little bit different than this time period. But if we're addressing that time period, most of the conversions to Islam that slaves did were not with the approval of their master. Generally, their masters were opposed to it because it would put them in a legally dicey situation. Empires then had to come up with what the law should be if a slave converts to Islam, right? Because if you can't make a slave of a Muslim, does that mean that a slave that becomes a Muslim is therefore not permitted to be kept as a slave? And most regimes came to the conclusion that no, conversion is insufficient to force manumission, but the children of a convert to Islam are born as Muslims, and therefore they cannot be slaves. So that was the general consensus around the rule.
Was there, when Omar freed the Muslim slaves, was there any compensation given to their owners?
I'm not aware of any. Nurul, do you know anything about that?
So I wanted to add some points on this one, right? So if you know, Richard, there is a person called Bilal, one of the companions of Prophet, and he was a slave actually, and he was owned by a non-Muslim, a polytheist living in Mecca, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in order for him, he accepted Islam, but he was still under his polytheist owner. So he wanted to get out. I mean, obviously he was suffering because his master was torturing him because he accepted Islam, and he disobeyed him. I mean, in terms of any work that he used to do, that was done fine. But in terms of believing that there is only one God, his master tortured him. So what Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did was he actually bought Bilal from that polytheist owner with some amount. And that amount, was 3 times what actually used to be the price at that time, because the owner saw an opportunity to grab more money. So he actually asked for more. And, in order for him to be freed from a polytheist owner and then practice Islam. So after that, Bilal became free. So yes, there has to be a price given in order to trade a slave and then make him a Muslim, right? So just giving a context to that whole, using a reference from the Sirah.
Right. Perfect. Thank you.
A question, rolling back a little bit further there. When you mentioned about Omar riding to Jerusalem, I've got a book around here on the destruction of libraries in Alexandria. And then it mentioned that when Omar got into Jerusalem, he actually liked the Christian bishop there.
That is true, actually.
Yeah. No, Omar had a good relationship with the Christians when he came to Jerusalem. One of the things that a lot of the Christians were expecting was for him to knock down the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He didn't, and he actually prayed outside of the church. Right, he kept his distance from the church when he prayed, and he chose the site for Al-Aqsa specifically because it was as far away from the church as it was, and the Christians had largely abandoned the Temple Mount. Right, because according to Christian prophecy, the Temple Mount was supposed to be a desolation until the return of Jesus. So the Temple Mount was basically empty, and that's why, I mean, there are the scriptural reasons why Omar chose that site as well, but it was an open esplanade that would not cause any conflict with Christians in terms of removing their structures or harming their structures.
So Richard, wouldn't that contradict the Pact of Omar that you have on the screen right now? So I've never heard of that, honestly.
Yeah, no, the Pact of Omar, this actually wouldn't be a contradiction of the Pact of Omar, because the Pact of Omar allows Jews and Christians their own sites of worship. It's and the thing is that the Pact of Omar has a number of different requirements. As I said, many Muslims consider it, both Muslims and non-Muslims. There's debate as to whether it's legitimate on both sides. But regardless of whether it is legitimate or not, a lot of rulers at different points in history used it as legitimation for discriminatory practices. Like one of the edicts of the Pact of Omar is that if a Jew or Christian sees a Muslim on the street, he will divert to the edge of the street, so that way he gives the Muslim the berth. That Jews and Christians will wear distinct clothing in certain places to identify themselves. This is, for example, where the Ottomans got the idea of the yellow turban, right? Because the Ottomans would eventually use a yellow turban to distinguish Jews from the remaining subject population. So there are things like that that establish a second-class status. But it doesn't mean that every church is going to be turned into a mosque. That was never the Pact of Omar.
Yeah, the second-class citizen thing is new to me. I mean, I've never heard that, honestly. Okay, anyways, I'll check it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. The term that was typically used was al-Dhamma, right? Or dhimmi in English. Okay. So as Omar took control, he wanted Khalid ibn al-Walid in the Levant region because of his abilities and his skill. So now Khalid was in Mesopotamia, and between Mesopotamia and Syria is a harrowing desert that's really difficult to cross. So, and this is debated by historians as to whether it actually happened, but the Muslim sources argue that Khalid came up with the idea of bringing a number of camels to a watering place and having them drink heavily to the point that their humps were engorged, and then slaughtering them across the pass, so that way the water could be drunk from the camels as they went through. And this way they were able to get to the Syrian side and take the Byzantines completely by surprise. And you can see his arrow coming from the north going south. At the same time, Omar from Medina sent 4 generals north, 3 into Palestine, 1 into Egypt. And those generals crossed with Khalid ibn al-Walid, and they fought a number of battles. You can see on the lower left, this is the Byzantine fort Ha'ela. It's near Ajnadain. Ajnadain was the place where the battle took place. It's in modern day Israel. And that battle took place in 634. There was also the capture of Damascus on Khalid ibn Walid's side. And then there was the Battle of Yarmouk, which is the Battle of the Yarmouk River. The Yarmouk River separates Syria from Jordan, or the Israeli held Golan Heights from Jordan, because that's the sort of the path it follows. And the Battle of the Yarmouk was one of the rare instances where the Byzantine forces and the Arab forces met each other head on, and it was an incredibly decisive battle. It's like one of the 10 most decisive battles in history. The Byzantine forces were effectively routed, and they were pushed back to this area called Andawahi in Arabic, which you can see on the circular map. It's basically a no man's land in the center of Asia Minor, and that became the effective border between the Muslims in Arabia and the Upper Middle East and the Byzantines for nearly 300 years. Now, of course, it shifted a little bit, and of course, there were raids across that border, but that effectively became the long-term border since neither side could penetrate it with an effective supply line. Now, I wanted to add that it wasn't just the men who were fighting. We have the story, for example, of Khawla bint al-Azwar. Her husband as well her husband as well was a military commander, and she fought at the Battle of Yarmouk, liberating a prison, freeing both her husband and a number of women who had been held in the prison, and fought in Khalid ibn Walid's corps. She was renowned for her bravery, and you can see, when Khalid ibn Walid retired, so did she.
Richard?
Yeah.
I didn't catch exactly. Yarmouk is in which state? Is it Syria or Jordan?
The battle itself took place in what's now Syria, but the river is the dividing border between it's the same way that the Rhine. Is the Rhine in France or is the Rhine in Germany?
Yeah, it's the border, yeah. Has that battle site been combed over by archaeologists?
Well, right now, the Syrian civil war makes that a little bit difficult. In the past, they have. The Battle of Yarmouk is actually well attested. By this point in history, while there may not be 100% agreement between the Islamic sources and the non-Islamic sources, there is enough agreement to say that these events happened. There are some questions, like, for example, did Khalid ibn Walid actually invade Iraq under Abu Bakr's orders, right? There's Abu Bakr, there's some debates as maybe Khalid ibn Walid joined al-Muthanna on a raid and then just got lucky and sort of went on his own. There are some who say that he never did this, right? But that it was but it's a confusion with the second invasion of Mesopotamia that was led by Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, which we're going to discuss in a bit. So, but generally speaking, this battle Battle of Yarmouk of 636, pretty much all the sides agree that the Muslims had an incredible victory. They faced the Byzantine forces head on, and the Byzantine forces were simply not able to prevail.
Yeah, the reason I ask is sometimes when archaeologists can get into the details, sometimes you can see concentrations of arrowheads or this armor or that armor, and sometimes that can tell you about movement of specific units, or how the battle played out, so to speak.
Yeah, no, there is a lot written on the Battle of Yarmouk because of its historic importance in military history. It's just not something that I focused on, so I couldn't give you the specifics.
Okay, just one quick one, Richard. We think of a battle as taking place in a day. This thing took 6 or 7 days. I mean, they were fighting this was not a quick fight. And it sort of swayed in both directions. Initially, the Byzantines seemed to have the advantage, but by the end, it was the Muslims.
Thanks, Joe. All right. So now we get to the second invasion of Mesopotamia. So Khalid ibn Walid is now in the Levant area. Omar became afraid that Khalid would then start gunning for the Caliphate, considering how effective he was as a commander, how strong his mubaris were, and sent him into retirement. Actual retirement, he didn't kill him. But Khalid ibn Walid is basically absent from the rest of this discussion, even though he is such a great general. So the person who then started to lead this second force, you have al-Muthanna, and he coordinated with Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas to attack Ctesiphon. Right, we remember Ctesiphon is actually very close to where Baghdad is today. And it was the Persian capital. So this on the upper left-hand side, you can see sort of a computer-generated view of what the city would have looked like. The only thing that survives of Ctesiphon is that central promenade, which is called the Taki Kasra. You can see what's left of it on the right-hand side. And
I'm sorry. I was trying to get into a pause. So that the pronunciation of that city, the C is pronounced like an S, right?
The C is silent. I don't know why there's a C in English. It's Ctesiphon.
Oh, okay. It's I was confused. It was always confusing. Okay, it's just ignore start with the pronunciation with Ctesiphon.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so in order to get to Ctesiphon, they had to cross the river. So they made a crossing at Qadisiyah. And Qadisiyah is, again, one of these incredible Muslim victories. The Persian forces were larger. They were simply poorly arrayed. And they were led by Rostam Farrukhzad, who was one of Persia's top generals. He was killed in this battle. Qadisiyah, of course, stayed in Iraqi memory as an incredible victory against heavy odds. Saddam Hussein, for example, would use it in several of his references to the war with Iran. All right. So once once the Battle of Qadisiyah was resolved in the favor of Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, he went to Ctesiphon and summoned the Deccan to him. As we remember from our studies of the Sassanid Persians in the second lesson, the Deccan are the landed elite, right, who controlled areas of the Persian Empire, and Sa'ad gave them an ultimatum. He said, you can keep your lands and your territories and your governing power if you convert to Islam. If you do not convert, you'll still live, but your titles and lands will be seized and given to those who do convert. Over 70% of the Deccan converted and kept their titles and positions under the new Islamic administration. Now, the fact that the Deccans were ordered to convert says nothing about whether the rank and file population was required to convert. In fact, we see no evidence that the Muslims pressed the local population to convert, only the Deccan, because they would have this governmental role. But now that Ctesiphon was conquered, the king, the Shahanshah of Persia, began to try and mount a defense. So he consulted, and this was Yazdegerd III. Yazdegerd III was a very young monarch. He was 8 at the time of the Battle of Nahavand in 642. So he was working with a number of his generals, including Piroz Khosrow. You can see him on the lower right-hand side. And they decided to meet the Arabs outside of Nahavand. You can see Nahavand is in central Iran, whereas Ctesiphon is closer, is in Iraqi territory today.
Hey, Richard, in terms of this conquest, how is it seen, of Persia by the Muslim Arabs? How is it viewed by modern Persians? Because they're Muslims now, so I could see they would see it positively, but they were conquered at the same time.
No, Persians generally see this as a black mark. Now, they're sort of two, but the Persian population sort of cleaves in two ways on this. I would say the majority, but then again, this is from my limited perspective of which Persians I've spoken to, and for reasons I'm going to get into, the second category probably wouldn't talk to me. Those Persians see Persian national identity and Persian culture as being something that is special and sacrosanct. And the Arabs, through their act of conquest, adulterated it in some way. That would be their argument. And that population tends to be more secular leaning. It tends to be less religious in orientation, and tends to be more westernized in political affiliation. The second group tends to be those who are devout Muslims and see this as the bringing of Muslim enlightenment to Persia, which was Zoroastrian and therefore was polytheist, right? According to the Muslim idea of what a polytheist is, right? Mushrik. So in this moment, the Arabs brought the light of Islam to the Persian civilization, and as we've seen so far, and we're going to see more of it, the general Arab treatment of the Persians that they conquered was favorable. They were integrated. They weren't forced to abandon their religion unless they wanted to aspire to high roles in government. And by and large, we don't see large-scale massacres with this invasion. It was a relatively peaceful invasion, for want of a better term, even though it was achieved militarily, but we don't see, it's not like the Mongols. Like, we're not seeing mass conquest, piles of bodies. That's not what's going on here. And so they see it as this sort of growth of Islam in the country. And those people tend to be more religious, more anti-Western, and tend to be much more focused on Islam as an Iranian project.
And a subsequent question, before you were talking about a 7-year period where there were 14 shahs.
Mm-hmm.
What, could you give the years in relationship to this conquest? How close was it?
628 to 635.
Oh, wow, that's right before. That's, okay. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no, Yazdegerd III had been in power for like just a few years before this happened. And as I said, he was a kid at the time. No, sorry. He came to power when he was 8. He was 16 at the time of the invasion. There we go. So yeah, he'd been in power for 8 years, but he was a kid. Like, he wasn't running this empire in any functional sense. If we remember from our discussion of the Sassanids, you had all these Parthians in the court who were almost always deciding who the next king would be. So this and the Parthians and the Deccan were fighting each other over who should be in power, and they were assassinating this king or that king. That's why the reigns were so short. So yeah, the Persian Empire was very unstable and in a position where it couldn't effectively defend itself. That said, though, at this point, the Arabs didn't have effective siege technology. So you can see the castle at Nahavand on the right-hand side would have been able to hold the Arabs out. The thing is that Yazdegerd III demanded that they sally out and meet the Arabs in open combat, where the Arabs were mounted and the Persians were not. And anybody who knows cavalry versus infantry, it doesn't usually work out terribly well for the infantry. Yazdegerd III was forced to flee, and he fled to Merv. You can see Merv on the map. It's sort of the upward arrow where it says like 709. That's Merv. In Merv, Yazdegerd III is murdered. We don't know the exact cause. The most common rumor or myth about why he was killed was that the person who killed him didn't recognize him, but saw that he had a satchel with a lot of money in it. So took the money, killed the guy, and ran, not knowing that he just murdered his own king. Other stories claim that he was fatigued from the long journey, but regardless, Persia was now left without any ruler. And Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas was able to integrate almost all of that area that's in dark green, because you can sort of see some of it's like in like yellowish green and some of it's in darker green. He was able to integrate almost all the area in dark green to the Islamic State, and the Sassanid Persian Empire ceased to exist. That said, right, because of what Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas did at Ctesiphon with all the Deccan, the organizational system of Persia under the Sassanids continued under Muslim domination. Okay. So, as we mentioned before when we were talking about the conquest of the Levant, 3 of those generals went into Palestine, and one, Omar ibn al-As, went to Egypt. So he went to Egypt and he reached out to the Copts. Now, the point of reaching out to the Copts was, if we remember, the Byzantines were extremely discriminatory against religious minorities. And that meant religious minorities of Christians as well, right? Any heresy was unacceptable, including the Coptic Church, which was the dominant church of Egypt. So you had a number of Coptic Christians who were ready allies to the Muslims when they invaded. Now, they didn't take up arms against the Romans, but they did the next best thing, which was provide supplies, maps, and other routes through the country. And Omar ibn al-As effectively conquered Egypt in about a month. bringing that entire area under Muslim control. No, sorry, he conquered it in 3 years. Yeah, bringing that entire area under Muslim control. But the Byzantines were unable to send reinforcements because they had lost the Levant region, right? So they had to send reinforcements over the sea, and the Arabs effectively made an entirely inland conquest. Yeah.
So the Omar is so great. He did so many things all under his leadership.
No. This is Omar ibn al-As. And then not Omar. Oh yeah, sorry. Omar. Oh, yeah. Omar was ruling as caliph while this was going on. And to a certain degree, he is responsible for sending all these generals out. But almost all of these generals acted autonomously. And remember also, right, from our last lesson, Omar ibn al-As was in the Meccan side fighting against the Muslims during that Mecca-Medina war. So you had all of these generals, both from the Muslim side and from the Meccan side, who had been fighting each other for 10 years, 8 to 10 years, getting really great battle experience, now being unleashed onto the world. So while Omar certainly gets some of the credit, a lot of the credit should be given to the fact that these were generals who had a lot of time-tested battle experience, and that Omar just let them do whatever they wanted to do.
Yeah, he's doing nothing, so that means he did a great job. So
exactly,
we see a lot of king. They actually, they just try to control their general, and turn out they're screwing up. So he did a great job, not control the generals.
Exactly. That's what happened. Now, of course, once these areas were conquered, they'd be integrated into the empire. Let me see. And he set up an administrative technique that we're going to discuss here.
And Richard, before you go into that, could I ask 2 quick questions? Was the invasion of Egypt concurrent with the invasion of Persia?
Yes, it was. So you can sort of imagine, right, like, this is not an empire that's attacking one position, advancing on the next position, advancing on the next position, sort of in a row. This empire is expanding in every direction at the same time.
That's amazing, because it breaks a golden military rule of never split your forces.
Yeah, I agree with you. But the interesting thing is that because all these generals sort of had their own troops, they were all acting autonomously. You can sort of imagine it like they were different countries.
It almost, it reminds me of the independence of Roman generals, their independence sometimes.
Yeah, no, that was a very common attribute in the early days of in the days of the Rashidun Caliphate and the Umayyad Caliphate, that generals were given an enormous amount of autonomy. And one of the things that caused a little bit of enmity was when Omar said that you couldn't just take war booty from the people you conquered, right? Because this was the primary motivation for conquest. Mm-hmm. What ended up happening was that Omar allowed other forms of wealth acquisition that would allow there to be a certain amount of war booty, but not making the local population destitute.
And so did you say there were 3 generals that went into Egypt independently?
No. 3 generals that went into Palestine from the south. And they met up with Khalid ibn al-Walid, who was coming from the north, right? Khalid ibn al-Walid was conquering Syria while they were conquering Palestine. And then they met sort of at Yarmouk.
Oh, gotcha. Thanks.
But 4 generals departed from Mecca, Medina, and the 4th one was Omar ibn al-As, who went to Egypt. Okay. So at the same time, after they conquered Egypt, the Rashidun Caliphate wanted to press further south. And so they invaded Makuria, which was a northern Sudanese kingdom. It controls territories that are today part of southern Egypt and northern Sudan. And they fought the Battle of Dongola twice, once in 642 and once in 652. The Nubian archers, the Makurian archers, sorry, better to say, the Makurian archers were more than a match for the Arabs, and the Arabs couldn't bring Egyptian boats down the Nile terribly far because of the cataracts. So they had so the Makurians being able to defeat them twice actually led to one of the few defeats of the early Islamic period. And the Muslims created what was called the Baqt, which is probably an Arabic rendering of the word paktut, right? A pact or an agreement. So the Baqt was made with Makuria, and the Baqt said that every year the Egyptian province of the Caliphate would send lentils and grain south to Makuria. Makuria would send slaves north in response, that travelers could come from either state to the other one and be free from harm. And it is actually one of the longest surviving peace treaties in the history of the world. The Baqt with Makuria survives until the 15th and 16th centuries. And Sudan stays Christian until that time. We actually have cases where, for example, this is in the center, this is a fresco from Wadi Asabwa, which is in modern Egypt today, but it's very close to the Sudanese border. And it's an Egyptian fresco with a Coptic priest in the center, because there was plaster paste painted over the old Egyptian carvings, and on top of it was painted this new kind of Christian iconography rather than replace the entire building. We also have, for example, the Cathedral of Faras, which existed at this time in Faras, which you can see is close to the M on Makuria. The Makurians were Coptic Christians, and Sudan would be majority Coptic Christian until the Islamic conquest of their territories, as I said, in the 16th century. So this was a Christian state on the border with the Muslims for generations. Arab writers chalked up the lack of conquest to the lack of importance of Sudan in their overall ambitions. And so the territory that they controlled by the end of Omar's reign is more or less the area in the orange. Some parts of Libya and Afghanistan and Turkmenistan that are included were not in Omar's hands, but pretty much everything that is orange or red was area that Omar controlled when he was assassinated in 644.
Excuse me, can you tell a little bit story about Omar's assassination?
Yeah, so Omar was assassinated by a Zoroastrian. His name was Feroz Abu Lulu, obviously because of the enmity that he had with the Muslims. And he actually was praying at that time when he came and assassinated him in the prayer. He didn't die instantly. He died 3 days after that. That's pretty much the story about Omar being assassinated and passing away.
Thank you, Nurul. Yeah. So the next one who took power was Uthman. Now, one of the things that distinguishes Uthman from the previous two rulers is that he is from a new clan, the Banu Umayyah. Now remember, this is still within the tribe of Quraysh, right? But instead of being Banu Hashim, this is Banu Umayyah. And Uthman had really made his life as a merchant. In fact, during the early persecution of the Muslims period, he fled to Ethiopia and eventually would come back to Mecca right before the Hijrah. So his expertise was primarily in managing the treasury, and that's what he did when he took power. It's important to also know that Uthman did not necessarily engender the greatest amount of support from across the caliphate, because generally speaking, he mismanaged a number of the different regions. And so there were a number of rebels that tried to attack him, and eventually he was killed in 656 by these rebels. One other thing to point out is we start to see Muslim presence under Uthman's raid in the Horn of Africa. The first one is in the city of Zayla, which is in modern Somalia, close to the border with Djibouti. In Somalia, it's the area controlled by Somaliland, close to the border with Djibouti. And this is the remains of that mosque. It's Masjid al-Qiblatain, the mosque of the two praying directions. Yeah, so this is when Muslims begin to start in Somalia. Now, Omar started this, and Uthman continued a process of creating a functioning administrative system. Now, the first thing that Omar had done was that he created the wali, or the governors, and he appointed these wali or governors to the various regions of the now controlled empire in order to effectively govern those areas. And so, below the wali, he kept the Byzantine or Persian administrative structures in place, so that way the territory could be properly controlled. Because remember, the Arabs at this point don't have the kind of functional experience to run a large-scale empire. So they need all of the help that they can get. Othman himself commissions one of his relatives in the Banu Umayyah, and one of the things that engenders a lot of hatred towards Uthman is that he is very partisan towards the Banu Umayyah, treating them to many posts, specifically because they are his relatives. One of the Banu Umayyah is in charge of putting together the first Arab navy, using mostly naval soldiers from Egypt who had been navy under the Byzantine period, and allowing the Arabs to move out at sea. They also began printing coins. You can see this is actually a Persian coin, which is why it has a face on it. But you can also see Bismillah if you look on the lower right-hand side, which was their way of making it legal tender within the Islamic empires. Later, when we get to the Umayyad Caliphate, we'll notice that they will abandon the use of faces on the coins. But in terms of the functional structure of this administration, almost all of the major players, aside from the wali, were from the conquered peoples, not from the Arabs who had conquered them.
So, Richard, who decide who should be the next caliph? Yeah. So how does they?
Yeah, no. So Abu Bakr was chosen by Shura. Omar was appointed. Uthman was also appointed. This became a massive issue of contention because the Shia or the supporters of Ali kept saying that Ali should be the caliph, and at each point he's being denied the caliphate.
So the previous one will appointed somebody will become my successor, right?
Yes.
So after he get the power, he immediately appointed the successor, or
no? Omar. They weren't appointed by the previous caliph. They were appointed, I think, by caretakers or. Yeah.
It's by voting actually. So by the Sahabas, right?
Okay. But it wasn't Shura.
It is a Shura, yeah. It is.
Oh, it was a Shura.
It's a committee, yeah. It is a group of people who decides it.
So then the committee decide who will be the leader next.
Yeah, so there are different ways of appointing a caliph. One is the previous caliph can actually mention that name, who can be the next caliph specifically. Or if he has not mentioned it, then the Shura, the whole unit of companions can actually nominate a couple of people, and then a voting system happens, and then the leader is chosen. So these are the two ways usually a caliph is done. And the third way, which is unconventional way, is if he takes it by forcefully. That's a third way of doing it.
Right.
Yeah.
So their son give to your son the crown prince. This kind of idea never happened.
Well, this idea will happen later, but it doesn't happen yet.
You're talking about Saudi Arabia right now?
No. Like the Umayyads had.
Umayyad? Yeah. So Umayyad is actually starting with what's his name?
Muawiyah. But we're gonna get to it in a minute.
So Muawiyah was the son of Abu Sufyan. So Muawiyah nominated Yazid by his he actually nominated him, and therefore everybody agreed to that. Had he not done that, I mean, probably they would have been chosen Imam Hussein to do that, to the next caliph. But since he did it, actually the Shura went with it.
Yeah. No, we're going to discuss that succession crisis because that led to the second fitna. We're gonna discuss that next week. All right. So we also begin to see, although this will pick up in later centuries, what's called ta'arib or Arabization. When the Arab administration came, basically they made two requirements. The first one is that the lingua franca would become Arabic. And so if you were to be involved in government processes, the language you would have to learn would be Arabic. And the second one is that Islam would be the dominant religion. You could practice other religions, right? You could practice Judaism or Christianity. And given the vast size and population of the Sassanid Empire, Zoroastrianism was also permitted, simply because it would have been impossible to remove them. Right, we're talking about a population of nearly 20 million people. It's just too many. So their religion was accepted, but if you wanted to be at the higher levels of government, you had to convert to Islam, right? That's how you would preserve your title or advantage or whatever government or business benefit you had at the higher tiers. So this thing called ta'arib or Arabization begins all across the territories controlled by the Caliphate. At the same time that we have the conquest of Persia, and at the same time that we have the conquest of Egypt, we also have the conquest of the Caucasus. So we begin with the map that's here is from a few years too late, but the borders are right for our period. So you can imagine at the height of, at 651, that those are the areas under the control of the Rashidun Caliphate. So Armenia was conquered in several stages. Because Armenia had been divided between the Byzantines and Sassanians, the Byzantine part fell much earlier, closer to 638, 639. The Sassanian part fell in the 640s. And they fell primarily because of dynastic issues within Armenia. You can see there's Theodoros Rushtuni. Theodoros Rushtuni originally fought for independence, but then fought with the Rashidun Caliphate against the remaining part of Armenia in order to secure his place because he had been unseated due to domestic Armenian politics. You also have a similar thing going on in Georgia. You have King Adarnase there, Adarnase II. He followed King Stephen II, who pledged his loyalty to the Rashidun Caliphate. King Adarnase fought against them, trying to secure independence. And while they won for a short period of time, a second wave of Arab invaders defeated them and added those territories to his rule. King Adarnase was king of Iberia, which is the eastern part of Georgia, closer to Tbilisi today.
But Richard, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why do you think, it's just a general question, I don't know the answer. Why do you think that Georgia and Armenia stayed Christian while, let's say, Egypt and Nubia weren't?
Well, Nubia goes Muslim much later, right? It's after the conquest in the 15th century.
Yeah, but in general, Persia didn't stay Zoroastrian, but Armenia and Georgia stayed Christian. What do you think is that?
It's a great question. I think that the Christian majorities that we see in Georgia and Armenia today are as a result of population reorganization. If we look at Georgia and Armenia when the Russians conquered them in the 1820s, you have a much larger percentage of Muslims in all of the areas. For example, Yerevan, the capital of Armenia today, was 80% Muslim in 1828 when it came into the Russian Empire. So I would argue that they actually didn't stay that Christian. They stayed as Christian as the areas that you're referring to, like Egypt. Egypt was 15% Christian when at the beginning of the 20th century. It's declined substantially because of some of the persecutions that occurred in the 20th and 21st centuries, and the corresponding exodus to the United States and other Western countries where they could find religious freedom, especially in South America. But it has a lot more to do with population reshuffling than it does with some magical ability to stay Christian. To be fair,
you mean that Armenia was mostly Muslim until 19th century?
With the exception of the area that we today call Nagorno-Karabakh, when the Russians conquered that area, there was no area of the Southern Caucasus that was majority Christian. The only exception I can think of, maybe the area around Tbilisi, but I would need to check statistics on that. The rest of the area I know was majority Muslim. In fact, one of the arguments that Azerbaijanis often use when they're talking about the ambitions of modern Armenia is that the Russians engaged in an act of Armenification, where they incentivized Armenians to move to the area around Yerevan, which is what led to, I mean, it's not like the Muslim population didn't increase as well over this time because of population growth and better nutrition and the rest of it. But the Armenian population grew so substantially that they became a majority where before they were a minority.
Richard, but what about the great Armenia that expanded all the way to Mediterranean at the time of Crusades?
Sure, what about it?
Wasn't that Christian?
Yes, but the Armenia that expanded from the Caucasus all the way to the Crusades, all the way to the Mediterranean, that is the empire of Tigran the Great.
Cilicia.
Well, no. Let me finish. That's the empire of Tigran the Great that was around the time of the Romans. The Armenians controlled Cilicia as an independent entity during the Crusades, but it was literally just that area around Cilicia. It did not expand all the way to the Caucasus. They didn't have that kind of strength. It was a small state.
Okay.
May I add something about Iran or Persia?
Sure.
People who are, Jewish people and Christian people were called people of the book. So they were accepted as people who believe in God, but Zoroastrians were not considered people of the book because Muhammad had never mentioned them in Quran or whatever he had said. So Zoroastrianism was not considered a religion of the God. So because of that, the pressure was much more on the Persians to change their religion than on the Christians and the Jews.
The thing is that because there weren't people of the book, there were different periods where their religion was acceptable is sort of a strong word, but it was permitted to a certain degree, and there were other times that it wasn't. But it was certainly not the case similar to Christianity and Judaism where they were acceptable. Although when we look at the conversion rates in Iran, they roughly match the conversion rates in the Levant and in Egypt. The majority of people become Muslim at the end of by the 11th century in all of those places. Slightly faster in Syria than in Iran, but generally speaking, it's about the same rate of conversion. So my intuition would be that the treatment of Zoroastrians generally over, especially the earlier period in time before the Safavids, would have been roughly the same as of Christians and Jews, even if their holy sites were barred. All right. The final conquest in 651 was of Derbent, which is in modern day Russia. So it's north of the modern Azerbaijani border. And you can see the fortress of Derbent, which was one of the great fortifications of the Sassanian Empire. It fell to the Arabs, and the Arabs called it Bab al-Abwab, the gate of all gates. As far as we can tell, the relationship between the Khazars, who had not yet converted to Judaism, and the Rashidun Caliphate was a good relationship. And in fact, the Khazars were helpful in putting down the revolt of King Adar Nasa II of Georgia, of Iberia. All right.
So, Richard, what's your opinion? You know, what do you think? What's the reason make the Arabians so powerful?
I believe that they had a combination of incredible generals, two empires that were in various states of functional decay, whose territories that they can move over, the advantage of cavalry, and the ability to work autonomously in different regions without having a combined single command.
As you said, I can add a very good luck of the Arabs exactly at the time that the Persian Empire was falling apart. Right. It was definitely falling apart even without the Arabs. It was at the end of its days. I mean, the Sassanid Empire, and of course, as you said, the Byzantine Empire. So the Arabs were very lucky. They came exactly at the time that two big empires at that place were falling apart.
Yeah. The Byzantine Empire would have survived if the Arabs didn't conquer it. The Sassanid Empire would not.
The Sassanid Empire was at the end of its road, It was falling apart by itself. It was falling.
Yeah, I think the Parthians and the Hephthalites would have taken it apart. Anyway, all right. So now we go into the conquest of Central Asia. So the main battle of Central Asia was in 651 at the Battle of the Oxus River, which you can see on the map. And the Battle of the Oxus River, the Sassanid forces were completely defeated, which left all of Khorasan, which is that upper region of Iran and Central Asia, open to conquest. And so the Arabs took it all in 651. That said, most of the indigenous, and the Arabs were led by Othman ibn Qais and by Abdullah ibn Amir, who was governor of Basra in southern Iraq. Right, because we have these walis or governors that are now appointed. So they win that battle, but the locals revolt. So you have revolts in Nishapur in 652, revolt in Herat in 652 as well. The Battle of Badghis in 654, where the Hephthalite Nezak Tarkan tries to take power back for the local people, right? Because the Hepthalites were the dominant population in these more mountainous parts of the Persian Empire. And generally speaking, these areas would not be fully integrated into the Islamic Empire until the Umayyad period and the conquest of Qutayba ibn Muslim. You also had the Sogdians managing to stage a very effective resistance during the same period.
I just want to add something. The photo at the right side is the photo of Yazdgir, which is the last Sassanid.
That's Yazdgir? Okay,
it's written there. I can read it.
You're right.
So he was the last Sassanid emperor that escaped and was killed around Khorasan by his own people.
Yeah. And now we finally get to the fourth caliph, which was Ali. So Ali finally ascends with the assassination of Uthman. We mentioned that Uthman was assassinated when his house was besieged in Medina because a number of different individuals did not like his partisan politics. So Ali was appointed, and Ali had the ability to really bring about a very diverse group of people into his camp. And in many ways, the fact that he hosted such diversity was an anathema to a lot of more rigid individuals who wanted him to remove anybody who had been loyal to the Banu Umayyah, the clan of Uthman. But he still kept that group together. However, he didn't feel like he could safely govern from Medina anymore. So he moved the capital to Kufa in central Iraq. You can see the great mosque of Kufa that is there now. You also have the beginnings of sort of Ali's designation as Ali has this sword Zulfikar. We've talked about it before, Zulfikar, with the two blades, and you can sort of see that this is actually a flag with Zulfikar from China in the 16th or 17th century. You can see both Sunnis and Shiites have a strong admiration for this sword and for its representation of Ali's piety.
So this Ali is the dead Ali, right? Shiite Ali.
This is the Ali. The Shiites finally get their caliph that they wanted.
Okay. So eventually they wait for like 30 years to get it.
Yeah.
So he must be old at this time.
He's older now. I think he's in his 50s. I mean, he was young during the time of Muhammad's life. Remember, he married the Prophet's daughter. So, but there is there was another man, Muawiyah, who was also from the Banu Umayyah clan, the same clan as Uthman, and he demanded that Ali investigate the causes of the assassination.
So they have the rumor, like, so Ali assassinate Osman.
No. There wasn't. Everybody knew that Ali didn't do it, but Muawiyah argued that Ali should investigate who was doing it, and Ali said, "I'm investigating." But Muawiyah didn't believe that Ali was doing it as diligently as he should have been, and Ali was arguing that he couldn't do it any more diligently, right? And so Muawiyah, who was now, because of Uthman's nepotism, he had appointed Muawiyah, who was his kinsman from Banu Umayyah, to be the governor of Syria. And so there were several battles that started between Ali and his forces and Muawiyah and his forces. For example, you can see there the Battle of the Camel. Aisha is there. She's actually in that sort of tube-looking thing. That's, if you see on the camel, there's sort of like a red tube. That's actually Aisha. She's hiding behind the tube because, of course, it would be sacrilege to show her face. Not because she's a woman and would be uncovered. So you can see her fighting Ali at the Battle of the Camel. There was also the Battle of Siffin. But what's important to know is that after these battles, which were incredibly taxing on both Ali's coalition and Muawiyah's coalition, there were peace negotiations. And a significant portion of Ali's forces defected as a result of these peace negotiations, not to Muawiyah's camp, but they made their own third sect called the Khawarij, meaning those who set apart. And you can see on this map that the territories controlled by Muawiyah are indicated in red, those controlled by Ali are indicated by green, and those controlled by the Khawarij, mostly Egypt, are indicated in blue. And the Khawarij believed that by entering into negotiations with Muawiyah and later being tricked by Muawiyah to admit some degree of fault in creating the Islamic Civil War, that he was no longer fit to rule. And so they required the utmost purity of somebody who had the right to rule. With this now three-sided civil war, Muawiyah was able to defeat Ali and consolidate power under his own authority.
So Muawiyah is from the Umayyad clan, right?
Yeah, exactly. Banu Umayyah or Umayyad clan. It's the same clan as Uthman.
Yeah. So Ali is in different clan, which is the same clan as Muhammad.
Right, exactly. He's Banu Hashim. So, of course, we're going to get into much more depth about this next week, but Muawiyah begins the Umayyad dynasty, right? The dynasty of the Banu Umayyah. So, Muawiyah's governorate, you can see there, is the governorate of Syria, which controls part of what's southern Israel today, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Muawiyah was buried in Damascus, and you can see on the map on the right-hand side, the furthest extent of the Umayyad Empire that would be far after Muawiyah died. But to give you an idea about how far this empire is set to expand. So that's the Rashidun Caliphate.
Yeah, Rashid, I just want to add one point here is that if you go back to the previous slide, so how Muawiyah became the caliph, from Islamic point of view, this is a slight different story we hold, is that, after Ali was assassinated by the Khawarij, so
I forgot to mention after at the end of the war, the Khawarij.
He appointed his son, Hassan, as the caliph. For 6 months, he was the caliph. And Hassan by himself went to Muawiyah, and then he gave his position to Muawiyah to end this whole chaos situation. It's just to make everybody the brothers again. So just to add this point, very important point here.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I forgot to mention that Muawiyah was able to take Ali's territories because Ali was assassinated by a Khawarij. And so naturally, when Ali was assassinated, there was a period of chaos, and Hassan was appointed caliph, and Hassan willingly surrendered the caliphate to Muawiyah.
So if that's the case, then they should not have more Shiite, right? So because the Shiites already peacefully merged with.
Well, the Shiites disagree with. They don't believe that Hassan willingly surrendered the caliphate. They believe that Muawiyah forced him to do that.
Hey, Richard?
Are you going to be covering? Sorry, Mark. The killing of the Karbala incident. Are you going to be?
That's going to be next week.
Okay, so I think that answer will come next week. Then in that case, so.
Yeah.
In terms of what is conquered in the green, I noticed the southern shore of the Caspian Sea seems to be unconquered. That's
correct.
Is there a reason? I mean, seems a bit odd there.
Yeah, that area of Iran is incredibly mountainous. That's the Alborz mountain. And the northern side of that mountain range actually resisted until about the 670s, 680s. So that was actually not under control of Muslims at the time of the Civil War.
Mm.
So how about the Khawarij, right? The third sect, they merge with other people or stay independent?
No, the Khawarij actually survived as a distinct sect for about 300 years. Then the Khawarij went through several reforms and for the most part disappeared. But the Ibadiyya sect of Oman, which is about 75% of Omani Muslims are Ibadiyya, is a reformed version of the Khawarij sect, far less puritanical. But other than that, Ibadiyya does not exist today. But they never merged into Sunni or Shiite. They remained independent.
Richard, like Persia, Egypt has its own, vast history and its own identity. To this day, Egyptians will call themselves Egyptian, not Arabs.
That's actually very contested. A lot of Egyptians call themselves both Arab and Egyptian. They don't. Okay. They see that. Okay, but yes.
I'm curious, how does Egypt compare to the Persians in looking at the Muslim conquest as a good or a bad thing? That does it break down into those same two categories you mentioned with the Persians?
It's much less in the first category, much more in the second category. Generally, most Egyptians see the Arab conquest as part of creating the modern Egyptian identity. They don't see it as a negative. They might see Islam as a religious issue if they're more secular minded, being an issue, but they won't take issue with the Arab conquest per se, right? They'll take issue with current Salafism or current the Muslim Brotherhood or whatever incarnation of modern Islamic politics there is, but they won't take as much issue with the Arab invasion. The Persians who take issue with the Arab invasion see it as a ruination of what was somehow a purer Persian culture, whereas the Egyptians are like, the Persians invaded us, the Greeks invaded us, the Romans invaded us. This is just the next invasion in a wave of invasions that creates a modern Egyptian identity.
I have to add that Persians are Shia, so they have a completely different view about the whole conquest and the Muawiyah and Omar, and they hate all of them except Ali and Hussein. So the whole world view is different. Iranians are Shia, they look at it completely differently than Egyptians who are Sunni.
Sure, but I would say that even during Iran's Sunni period, right, because Iran did not become majority Shia until the Safavids, even during Iran's Sunni period, there was a lot of disdain for the idea that the Arabs came in, these barbarians of the South, and it was sort of the bull in a china shop sort of image of there was this beautiful thing and then you just smashed it. So that sort of view existed before the Shiitization of Iran. And it doesn't really have a parallel in Egypt. There's just not that kind of negativity.
This view about the Arab conquest started mostly with the Pahlavi dynasty around 100 years ago when Reza Shah came to power.
Okay.
Yeah, he started the Iranization of Iran, you can say. Before that, there was no distinction. I mean, Iranians didn't have any problem with considered, I mean, Muslim or something. But after the Pahlavi dynasty came to power, especially with Reza Shah and then his son, Mohammad Reza, they were very much focusing on the Iranian part of Iranian history than the Arab part of it.
Right, yes. Sorry, Greg, you had a question?
But do you think the Iranians now look down to Arabs?
Yes. I mean, you can support me or disagree with me on this, but there's generally a perception in Iran that Iranians are more civilized than Arabs are. I think the right equivalence for a lot of Westerners to think about it is the view of France and Spain. The way the French view Spain is very similar to the way the Iranians view the Arabs. Sort of lazy and unsophisticated.
So, Richard, I think that other than Sunni and Shia, there's another one called Ishbat or something. It's in the Yemen or something.
No. Sorry. I'll write it in the comments. It's Ibadiyya.
Ibadiyya.
And it's in Oman.
Ibadiyya is actually a group of Khawarij itself.
Yeah,
it's a segment. It's a sect of Khawarij.
Yeah, it's reformed Khawarij. The Khawarij, as pure and as fanatical as they were at this point, did not survive. But Ibadiyya did survive, and it's a reformed form of Khawarij.
I remember the Ibadiyya is very early, right? Very early split from Shia. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Right, because you have to realize that this is the split between Sunni, Shia, and Ibadiyya. All three of these sort of split at the same moment, right? Those who are the definitive supporters of Ali are Shia, those who support Ali but accept Muawiyah or supported Muawiyah, either one of those two became the Sunni, and those who rejected both Ali and Muawiyah became the Khawarij. And that division, although it was political initially, began to have religious overtones as time went on. And so that split exists to this day, but the numbers are not proportional, right? As Nora pointed out, roughly 80 to 85% of Muslims around the world are Sunni. The remaining 10 to 15% are Shia, and Ibadiyya makes up less than 1%. We're talking fraction.
Hey, Richard, regarding the Christian communities, like the Copts are about, if I remember correctly, about 10% of Egyptian society.
Yes, today.
But they're far less numerous in other countries of Palestine or Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and Iraq. Is there a reason why the Egyptian Christians stayed a larger minority than in other regions?
There's a lot of debate about this. My intuition here is that the Coptic Church served as an ethno-national identity marker in much the same way that the Armenian Church served as an ethno-national identity marker, or that Judaism serves as an ethno-national identity marker. But the majority of the Christians that existed in the Levant were Greek Orthodox. And so their community was the same as the dominant society that they were living in. So as that shifted, Greek Orthodox churches shifted with it. So a perfect example is how Coptic, Armenian, and Jewish services are not given in the vernacular. They're given in the historic languages of those people, right? Coptic services are given in the Coptic language, which is a version of the ancient Egyptian language. Armenian services are given in the Armenian language, and Jewish services are given in Hebrew. Greek Orthodox services throughout the Levant switched to Arabic about 100 years after the conquest, because that became the dominant language of their congregations. They don't pray in Greek anymore. So you had, and that's just one example. There were numerous other examples where the Christianity didn't serve as a cultural locus of identity. And I think because that happened, you had a much greater assimilation culturally and eventually that led to a greater conversion. I think another thing to consider is that you're looking at the numbers today and not the numbers where they were at this period in time or any period of time on the spectrum. A perfect example is that if you look at the census of 1920 in Lebanon, you'll see that 80% of the Lebanese population, and what the French considered Lebanon, was Christian. It was still 80% at that time. And that was after the Great Famine of Mount Lebanon, which occurred during World War I, where half the Maronite population died because the Ottomans cut them off from food. So compare that to today, where Christians are only 41% of Lebanon, and there's a lot of reasons that that number has shrunk to about half in terms of the percentage of the overall population. The first is that the Muslim population has increased. There's been a mass exodus of Lebanese Christians to South America especially, but to North America as well. There's been the Civil War, which led to a lot more Christians leaving because they had the means and ability to than Muslims did. So there's a lot of different pieces to that question, and it's not so cut and dry as there's just one factor that makes the Egyptians somehow special. Does that sort of answer it?
Yeah, it does. Thanks.
Anything else before we close up for the night?
Well, I just wanted to thank Richard. If anybody has any more questions, please go forward right now. If not, just want to remind people there's 2 more presentations, and Richard's doing another one next week.
We're doing the Umayyad Caliphate next week.
Umayyad Caliphate, sorry, Umayyad Caliphate. And tomorrow we're doing a Timoleon of Plutarch. You don't need to read it, but you could just come by and listen to us dissecting an ancient text. And on Sunday, we have an interesting one, music in medieval time, and we have a invitational one. A PhD in music would probably present, how the medieval music was perceived, and maybe we'll hear one or two samples. We'll see how it goes. But Richard, again, this was great, amazing presentation. And I just want to wish everybody a nice evening. And if you have any questions, you could just ask. If not, we'll close out for today.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you, everybody.
Richard.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. So cool.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you.
Richard.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right,
Thank
see you
you,
next week.
Richard.